Well, welcome to the Catherine of Siena College and this online course, Landscapes of the Soul, Creation, Creativity and the Natural World. And we're now at week 1, starting from 15th of February, and we're going to be looking at sacred trees. And I'll be presenting this. I'm Dr. Nick Mayhew-Smith, the course tutor, and I'll be taking you through these slides, and we'll start with the next one right now. Our story begins here, at the foot of a sacred yew tree, in a modern-day churchyard in Surrey at the foot of this magnificent yew tree. And our story also begins in biblical terms at the foot of a sacred tree, as we'll see. And of course, our course starts here as well. This is session 1, looking at sacred trees such as this magnificent specimen. Now, dating yew trees is a bit more of an art than a science, but this tree here is thought to be anything up to 4,000 years old, which is of course far older than the church which stands alongside it, even though this building is in fact medieval. And there are many other churchyards in Britain and Ireland which have just such specimens of ancient yew trees that the church was built alongside. And you might at first think, why? Why would anyone do that? When you hear the term sacred tree, you might immediately think of paganism, not Christianity. Well, as I mean to show you as this course goes on over 10 weeks, the way our understanding of God and the divine and creation is worked out is very much wrapped around natural features such as this tree. This is how our faith is developed from the very beginning. In the Bible onwards, we're going to look at many ways in which the landscape, landmarks, specimens, trees, plants, the rest of creation has helped to illuminate this essential story for us, our understanding of the divine and our place in the divine order. So we're going to look at the way that Christianity has picked up an ancient tradition that goes back all the way to our origins. For where would we be if it were not for our trees, both in terms of our pure survival as a species and also in terms of our spiritual story. So this is an image of Adam and Eve and the tree of knowledge in the Garden of Eden. This was our first reading exercise for this week. You may remember I asked you to look out for references to nature, to natural objects in the reading, not just at the start of Genesis and those 7 great days of creation, but afterwards too, as Adam and Eve settle into their lives, and when they have a very pivotal encounter in the Garden of Eden. So I'm talking, of course, about this tree in the heart of the garden. The tree of knowledge of good and evil, as it's called. This is the first object in all of creation to be subject to divine protection. You cannot harvest the fruit from its branches, as God mandated, as he's there pointing his finger in this image. Otherwise you will suffer death. That is, in other words, a sacred tree. That is a tree with divine power and rules that mark it off as special. On to the next slide. And not only do we have a sacred tree in the Garden of Eden, shortly afterwards, of course, a snake then turns up with a miraculous ability to talk. So, once again, when we consider the spiritual power of nature during our course, we should be very careful about dismissing the idea so quickly as paganism or nothing to do with modern Christianity. It's quite clear that the earliest religious stirrings in any society, including the Jewish people, had a very intense sense of the power of the natural world as a place of spiritual encounter. Not for nothing is the very setting of the Hebrew Bible known as the Holy Land. Sacred trees and talking snakes are just the beginning of this powerful story. As we will see throughout our course, that power has been channeled, focused, celebrated and expressed in so many ways during the development of Christianity, and in other religions too for that matter. Today we in the church don't really have any tree rituals to speak of, or at least not ones that are in common practice. But that's not to say there is no longer any Christian expression, any meaning in that age-old deep desire to connect with nature, to find the Creator God alive and working in and through creation. It's just today we find different ways to articulate it now, and it will be something I'm sure you are starting to come across in your own faith traditions. And that is the need for all of us to do all that we can to protect the environment. And this is a point that will run throughout this course, because the most obvious way now in which our relationship with the natural world has a place in religious activity and thinking, is this environmentalism? This is our modern expression of that age-old story. You probably don't need reminding that the second major encyclical produced by Pope Francis was Laudato Si in 2015, shortly after he became Pope in 2013, 2 years beforehand. So we go to the next slide of that. And here is Laudato Si. And if the topic of environmental theology, which is what Laudato Si is all about, Pope Francis's book, if that still seems slightly controversial or perhaps not yet fully accepted as part of Christian tradition yet, rest assured that is nothing new in religion. Our relationship with the natural world is complicated, and that's true from the very outset in scriptural terms and in church tradition too. So I will show you now just how deep-seated this goes, this ambivalence about our relationship to nature. If you were to read a bit further on in Genesis from the reading we've had this week, you will come to another hugely important encounter at the foot of a sacred tree. This is a famous scene in the Bible where Abraham meets 3 angels. There's an icon depicting this very scene, one you may well have seen yourselves, painted by the Russian Orthodox iconographer Andrei Rublev, and that's on the next slide. And this is Andrei Rublev's Trinity icon, it's called. It's a very powerful image. It shows the encounter between Abraham and 3 strangers, 3 angels who come to him. And if you look very carefully at the back of this image, just to the right of the central figure, you will see there is a tree appearing behind him. So let's read what the Bible says about this encounter. And I'm going to start off by quoting from the NRSV translation of the Bible. On to the next slide. So here in Genesis 18, we read about that scene that made the Trinity icon by Andrei Rublev. And this is what it says in the NRSV translation. The Lord appeared to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre, as he sat at the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day. He looked up and saw 3 men standing near him. Now, these oaks of Mamre appear on several other occasions in the Hebrew Bible. The encounter that took place here cannot really be overestimated, because those 3 men visiting Abraham have long been interpreted in Christian tradition and in that icon as no less than the 3 persons of the Trinity: God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit. But now let's move on to another translation of that same passage, because if you have checked in your own Bible, you might well have been a bit puzzled, because the King James Version, and some other versions as well, say this instead about this great meeting place. It says, "And the Lord appeared to him in the plains of Mamre, and he sat at the tent door in the heat of the day, and he lifted up his eyes and looked, and lo, 3 men stood by him." So, what has happened here to the oaks of Mamre? Why are they translated as the plains of Mamre instead? The reason for this is that this version of the Bible, this second reading we've got here, the King James Version, is based on a Bible translation from Hebrew to Latin that was undertaken by the 4th century Christian scholar St. Jerome. And if you happen to want the original Latin and Hebrew for this, just to see, let me know and I can point you in the right direction for those tools. Now, this was Jerome's translation of the Bible, and it's not the first time he mistranslates the word tree as plain, something very different. If you look in the next slide at Genesis 12:6, he does exactly the same thing again. Here we are in Genesis 12:6. Abraham passed through the land to the place at Shechem, to the oak of Moreh. That's the NRSV translation, based on the Hebrew. And then here is the King James Version, based again on St. Jerome's translation, and he put, "And Abram passed through the land unto the place of Shechem, unto the plain of Moreh." Here again we have a famous landmark tree, one that is so important the tree even has its own name, Moreh. And indeed so powerfully spiritual is this tree that the passage goes on to explain that Abraham stops and builds an altar underneath its branches in the shade of this very tree. Yet again we see here that Jerome has translated the word for tree as plain. Now, some scholars have suggested rather generously that Jerome might have been a bit confused, struggling a bit with an unfamiliar word in the Hebrew, the word for a type of tree or oak. But I think that's probably being a bit generous to him. If you were to read on further in the same book of the Bible, in Genesis to chapter 35, it refers to Jacob burying some foreign idols under a tree. And the original text is again using that same Hebrew word that he's translated as plain in the past. Here, of course, with the burial of idols, there's a clearly pagan association with the place. And here, for the first time, as you'll see in the next slide, Jerome seems entirely happy to translate that same Hebrew word he's previously been translating as the plain as the oak tree, as you can see next. Okay, so here we have Genesis 35, and you'll see here that the NRSV translation, based on the Hebrew and the Greek, is in accordance with the same translation of the same passage from Jerome. Under the oak. The foreign gods, the idols, are buried under the oak. And for the translation that's being done here by St. Jerome, that is no longer problematic to him. You might even remember that this here tree is the same one we've previously met at a place called Shechem. So there's not really any good excuse why Jerome feels he has to switch the way in which he translates this word. It's the same tree, and yet at one place he calls it a plane, and here he accepts that it's actually an oak. So why? Why is he mistranslating this word? What is going on here? Why is the translation of the Bible itself being contested at this early stage of the Christian word? Why does Jerome seem so reluctant to use the word tree to describe an important place of spiritual encounter? Now, it's obvious that something is going on here, some act of censorship. Jerome is very uncomfortable with the idea that the Hebrew Bible is celebrating spiritually significant trees. Well, it turns out that Jerome's anxiety about sacred trees and why he tries to avoid them reflects precisely the situation in Europe at the time he was living and working, which is the late 4th century. Just a few years, maybe a decade, before Jerome was working his way through the Bible and studiously avoiding that word tree whenever he could, whenever it was associated with any sort of holy or sacred context, he'd use the word plain instead. Over in Gaul, which is modern-day France, the bishop, St. Martin of Tours, was busy converting the pagan people. St. Martin was conducting a missionary campaign that took him deep, deep into the countryside, and it was there, in his mission, that he encountered a group of villagers, according to one of the reports of his mission, a group of villagers who venerated, who worshipped an ancient evergreen tree, some sort of pine tree, worshipped as their god, as you'll see in the next slide. So here is a picture of St. Martin on the right with his bishop's hat on, and the pine tree that was being worshipped by the pagan people. And according to the life of St. Martin, which was written very soon after his death by somebody who knew him, the villagers had stood around doing nothing while he destroyed their pagan temple. But then Martin, being, as you can see, a powerful Christian bishop who used to getting his own way, insisted that their divine tree should also be cut down. So angry were the villagers at this point, they refused to let him do it unless he stood beside the tree in the direction it was likely to fall, in the hope that it would actually fall on him and crush him for desecrating their holy tree. You can read the life of St. Martin found in modern translation in one of the books listed in the bibliography, if you want full details of this very dramatic scene as the sacred tree is being cut down. As luck would have it, when St. Martin agrees to stand by the tree, or a miracle would have it, as the hagiography says, the tree actually fell in a different direction and proved, supposedly here, was the moral of the story, that Martin's God was keeping him safe, and it was therefore superior to the supposed God of the tree that was powerless, that was chopped down by him. So we can see here in this one incident that sacred trees were hugely contested in Europe around the year 400. They were not just slightly important devotional landmarks, but they were central to the faith of many of the people the missionaries were trying to convert at that time in Europe. The last thing Jerome, the Bible translator, and St. Martin would have wanted would be to legitimize the very cult of sacred trees, of divine-like trees, they were actually trying to stamp out among the common folk. Now, we don't know a great deal about pre-Christian religious traditions in Europe, away certainly from the centres like Rome, but one of the few things we do know for certain is that a lot of that early pagan religion was indeed based around trees and groves. Giant specimens of long-lived trees, like that one we saw in the beginning, growing outside the church at Crowhurst in Surrey, they crop up again and again in tales of Norse, Celtic and Germanic paganism, such as Yggdrasil, the giant ash or yew tree in Scandinavian lore, or Thor's oak in Germany. We know about these trees partly because of the stories of the first missionaries, such as St. Martin, who took great delight in finding these ancient holy places of the pagans and then destroying them, chopping them down. And we'll see another example of that in the next slide. And here we have the Christian missionary Boniface doing much the same thing as St. Martin had done in Germany in the 8th century. There, on his mission to the German people, he had cut down a huge ancient tree called Thor's oak or Donar's oak, depending on the translation, a tree that local pagans had venerated for many centuries in a place called Frisia, a region of northern Germany. Boniface then used the pile of wood that he got from the tree he chopped down, he used it to build a church, which in a way, although he was obviously destroying the tree, it does arguably permit a certain sense of continuity in the construction, taking that wood, suggesting that the material of the timber itself might have some kind of lingering spiritual power or significance, and using it to build the new church. And everywhere you go across mainland Europe, you hear this same sort of story. The ancient trees being cut down, the sacred groves burned, while the pagan temples alongside were ransacked or destroyed. If you do want to read the extended chapter, which is from a book I wrote partly about this topic in 2019, you can read of some more examples of this great campaign of tree destruction in mainland Europe. But why was it so aggressive like this? You can see Boniface there with his axe hacking away and the people cowering in fear. Why was it such an aggressive campaign? Well, you need to remember that Europe, at the time of the early church, all of these things happening, the church was still under the Roman Empire, or the lingering effects of it. It was a place where there were rules of authority. There were power structures, soldiers, local magistrates, local power centres, people who could back up someone like St. Martin with the official power and authority needed to chop down trees. But when you travel to the very edges of the Roman Empire, however, rather than the centre of mainland Europe, things do start to look rather different. And that's a point we're going to come to again on this course, that what happens in the margins of the landscape, away from the cities with their cathedrals, their hierarchies, their power centres, away from those centres, in the margins, Christianity takes on a much more soft, a much more accommodating attitude towards the natural world. Whether that is in the Celtic lands of Britain and Ireland, or in the eastern deserts of the Holy Land, you might be glad to know that in those places there's a slightly more happy fate about those great sacred trees, those ancient specimens, and the early Christian church. Not all of those trees were in fact chopped down like this. Now you remember that tree I was telling you about where Abraham met the three angels in the Trinity icon? It might surprise you to know that what remains of what is said to be that very same tree that's there in the Hebrew Bible can actually be seen today. And it sits in the centre of an Orthodox monastery in the Holy Land, in the Palestinian territories near Hebron, just outside the town of Mamre. And I'll show it to you in the next slide. So there you go, there it is. That is the Oak of Mamre today, inside the grounds of the Russian Orthodox monastery of the Holy Trinity, which was built specifically around this great remains of this enormous tree, this important tree. Whether or not this is the actual tree where Abraham sat, we don't really know, but this monastery was built here in the 19th century to protect the tree. As you can see, the tree is now dead, but it does have a sprig, a young sprig, growing up alongside it. And there are reports all the way back through church history of Christians visiting this very tree as a site of pilgrimage. So tree pilgrimage, tree veneration, prayers at trees are very much part of our Christian history, no matter what we might initially feel about it. There is an example in the middle of a monastery, there in the Holy Land. So that brings us back to our churchyard tree at Crowhurst in the next slide. And as you can see, this tree here in Crowhurst is still very much standing and indeed very much alive. It's next to the Church of St. George in the village of Crowhurst in Surrey. So why was this tree saved, along with so many other similar ancient trees around Britain and over in the eastern deserts too, the tree that Abraham met, tree of Mamre? Now in the British Isles, the evidence indicates there was a very different approach to sacred trees during the conversion from paganism to Christianity. There are no stories of the sacred trees being cut down. There are no church decrees condemning the veneration of ancient oaks, pine trees or yew trees until as late as the early 11th century, or maybe the late 10th century. So it's much later on, while Christians all over Europe were busy decimating the holy forests and groves in the name of the new religion in mainland Central Europe, something rather different happened when Christianity reached the further reaches of the Roman Empire and when they got to the British Isles. There's a famous letter that Bede records in his history. If you know Bede's great history, it's in the bibliography, Book 1, Chapter 30. It was a letter written by Pope Gregory the Great to the early bishop Mellitus in Britain. And he says in that letter to the missionaries of Britain that the old pagan temples should not be destroyed, but rather they should be converted to Christian use. And this letter specifically refers to the trees that surround these great worship sites. And this is often interpreted by historians as a surprisingly magnanimous and innovative gesture by Pope Gregory the Great. But in fact, if you read it carefully, what he says is it's obvious that this is a phenomenon that's already happening in Britain. It's already well known. It's a successful template which he is prepared to accept as being a valid way of converting the old pagan sacred sites. You can read the letter in full in Bede's history if you look at the bibliography. And on our next slide, I will show you an example of a church built in one of these ancient sacred groves. Okay, and here we are at what's called the Knowlton Henge Church at Knowlton in Dorset. And this was a church, and there was an even earlier church on the site, a very early church in Anglo-Saxon times during the conversion period of the English people. There was a church built inside what is a much, much older sacred pagan enclosure, which also once had a grove surrounding it, a grove of trees going round it. Just 2 of the trees are left from the ring of yew trees that once stood, and you can see those in the background, that great big dark green, just to the left of the church on the perimeter of the earthworks, this ancient pagan site. 2 of the ring of yew trees are still there in the background. Now, in terms of the kind of political, social necessity of this policy of saving these pagan temples and their groves and reusing them for Christian sites, building churches in the middle of them, possibly well, indeed almost certainly reflects the fact that there were no real imperial power structures in Britain left behind from the Roman Empire to enforce any decree to destroy, to break up these sites completely. Unlike St. Martin in Gaul and Boniface in Germany, they didn't have the might to go in and just desecrate wholeheartedly as they had done. Britain, and particularly Ireland as well, were both tribal regions. In Ireland in particular, there was a well-developed system of actual sacred tribal trees called biles, which were simply adapted to suit the new religion of Christianity. The three main churches in Ireland were and still are at places called Derry, Durrow and Kildare, and all of these three contain the word dare, Derry, Durrow, Kildare, which is the Old Irish word for oak tree. Kildare in particular translates directly as kill, which is church, and dare, church of the oak tree. That's where St. Bridget comes from, Bridget of Kildare. And trees were absorbed peacefully into the new Christian religion, as we can see by these place names. What was an important tribal meeting place at one point under the great tribal trees, the great oak trees, they became an important place for Christians to gather for their own worship too. So in Britain and Ireland, numerous ancient trees, such as these two you can see here at the back of the Knowlton Henge, survived the transition from paganism to Christianity. They not only survived, they became central to the new religion as well, with churches built right up against them, as we've seen. The later hagiographies explain this away by claiming that the missionary would plant a staff in the ground when they turned up, trying to explain why there was a sacred tree next to a church. How could that be in the later church, later on in history? They say the missionaries would plant a staff which miraculously sprang into life. There's two famous examples I'll show you. You can skip through. The next slide doesn't have a soundtrack, and the one after that does. So we just saw the Glastonbury thorn tree in Somerset, and now we're looking at another sacred yew tree and adjoining beech tree at Congresbury in Somerset. Those are two trees with tales told of the missionary coming and planting their staff in the ground and the tree springing to life, trying to explain away why there's a church next to a sacred tree. And similar tales are also told. It's not just these few examples I've given you, of many other tales of the early missionaries. St. Ninian, St. Etheldred of Ely, St. Aldhelm and St. Kenelm also did this. And of course, as mentioned and as we've seen, there are also these ancient yew trees growing in many of Britain's churchyards. The archetypal sacred tree is still there, growing alongside the churches. And this particular type of tree, the yew tree, the evergreen tree, is also the dominant tree in all those pagan religions we've been discussing. Yet here in our very own churchyards, even today, we see some of these very trees. Some of them thousands of years old, like our specimen at Crowhurst, where we began our session today. And they're often planted right outside the front door of the church, so that the first thing you see when you go out of the church, or when you go in, you pass it, is that sacred tree. And in fact, many of the churches, the trees are so old, like at Crowhurst, they vastly predate any Christianity. They're much older. Yew trees are famous for being very, very long-lived. They're often planted, so often the tree was there first. The tree was the important place, and the church was added much later, almost acknowledging the power of that sacred site, acknowledging the power of the tree. And they were aligned. So they deliberately built the church so that the first thing you would see as you emerged from your Sunday service out of the south door, you would see the tree right in front of you. I'll show you one in the next slide. So here's another tree which is actually quite near to the one at Crowhurst. This is the village church of Dunsfold, also in Surrey, not that far away from the Crowhurst yew tree. And here you can see on the right is the very ancient yew tree. Again, you can go inside it. It specifically aligns with the church door. You can see the porch of the church where people would go in and out, and it directly faces towards this ancient yew tree. There were no axes and no cutting down going on here. Quite clearly the opposite happened. The first Christians decided they would build their church so it aligned with, paid homage to, the sacred tree that was already there. And there are many theories why yew trees, why are they sacred, why are they all over so common in our ancient churchyards in Britain. And I'll focus on just one of those reasons for you now. There's lots and lots of theories out there, but the reason I would like to focus on is the yew tree, that tree you can see there in that picture. This is one of the most poisonous plants imaginable, one of the most poisonous plants there is. Just 100 grams of material from the average yew tree, whether it be twigs or leaves or berries, 100 grams of material has enough poison in it to kill a human being. So, not that holy, you might think. But remember also that animals, farm animals, will also know that a yew tree is special and poisonous, and they won't graze around it. One thing you will not see around yew trees is the farm animals. So the yew trees are growing in places that are set apart naturally from exploitation. They're set apart from agriculture. They're set apart from grazing, from normal human use. They're divine spaces, not human spaces for exploitation. So it's entirely possible that the earliest churches, which appeared after the trees were already in position and being used for religious sites, they appeared afterwards. They were set up as little enclaves of sanctuary around a hermit or a missionary's first dwelling place, early church. If you read the tales of Celtic saints in particular, we often hear how these early pioneers of Christianity, these first missionaries, would protect animals from hunting in these little enclaves, just as they protected the trees. They would forbid any sort of agriculture in these enclaves too. And wild animals, the stories tell of many Celtic tales. If you've read any Celtic hagiography, you'll hear about wild animals who would flock to the saints in great number. Deer, geese, swans, hares, ravens would cluster around the saints. They would become part of their congregation. I'll show you one of those in the next slide. And here we have the great Irish saint, St. Kevin of Glendalough. This is a modern day sculpture of him, obviously, and it shows him. He's in Ireland, Glendalough in Ireland. It shows represents a story about him. Supposedly one day in Lent, St. Kevin was praying with his arms outstretched, as you can see, when a bird came along and built a nest in one of his hands. And St. Kevin was so protective of this member of his flock, he didn't move for the whole of the 40 days of Lent, so his hagiography says, waiting until the egg hatched and the little bird could fly away safely. So as you see, the churchyard here, that early place where the missionaries go, is a place where all are sheltered under the tree, where all the birds of the air can sit in the branches, as another parable of Jesus puts it. The tree can therefore be seen as a symbol of the church, a protective place. That church, that tree, come together as somewhere that gives sanctuary to the animals, there protected by the missionary who's in charge of the sacred place, set apart from exploitation. Another thing we haven't really got time to go into today is, of course, the way in which the tree was also seen as a symbol for the cross too. It's quite clear, looking at St. Kevin here, with his arms outstretched and his cross vigil form of prayer, that he is both a tree and a cross for the bird nesting in his hand. He's fulfilling those two functions there, sacrificing himself, going through great physical strain in order to protect the bird. So the tree, whether it is as a cross plant in the ground or a place where the tribal people meet, this central place like this, it denotes a sacred space or an enclosure, a special area of land set apart. So this is part and parcel of our long story of land conservation, of preservation. And I'll finish by explaining and giving you an example of just how far this is important, knowing these stories, these links back not only to Christian tradition, but as ways to connect us to other people too. The environment is a great meeting place between us and the divine, between us and God, between those angels that Abraham encountered at the foot of the tree of Mamre. And also nature is a place of encounter between us and the blackbird there in St. Kevin's Hand, the bird he sheltered, and the environment and sacred places in the environment are also great meeting places between humans of every kind and humans of every faith too. So let us finish by looking at a story from India, which I think demonstrates why we should continue to cherish our trees, place higher value on them. Whatever form that might take today, we need to protect, look after and care for our trees. And the church has a voice within that. So the final piece of research I'm going to present to you is set back in the year 1730 in the region of Rajasthan. It involves a woman called Amrita Devi who followed a form of Hinduism called Bishnoi. And you can correct me on all those pronunciations if anyone can do better than me. And we'll look now at what her witness was in the next slide. So here we are. Here's a picture of what are known as the sacred tree martyrs, those Bishnoi Hindus in the year 1730. And the young woman, Amrita Devi, was appalled when she'd heard that the local Maharaja wanted to cut down the village's grove of sacred acacia trees in order to get some timber to build a new palace. And there you can see the grove of trees on the left. So she went and put her arms around the tree to protect it. And she was killed on the orders of the Maharaja's soldiers for defying him and trying to protect the tree which the Bishnoi considered to be sacred. This is where the word, you may know this is where the word tree hugger comes from. Someone who is very concerned about protecting the environment. This event, many of you may know, is known as the Kajali massacre. And a total of 363 Bishnois were killed in this terrible event when they were trying to protect that sacred grove of trees. Another religion, that same story about the trees being important in the faith. And I'm sure, obviously there are reasons with spirits in the trees and everything else, but I'm sure anybody with some sense about India, about the landscapes of India, or anywhere else indeed in the world which has mountains and very heavy monsoon-like rainfall, can tell me why it might be suitable and sensible to have rules that will protect trees growing on mountains, particularly in somewhere like northern India. We cannot just view trees as purely material objects with no other value than just seeing them as timber, because if you overexploit them, then terrible things will happen, as you'll see in the next slide. And here we see the aftermath of the terrible flooding during particularly heavy rains in Uttarakhand, again in northern India, a bit further over, northeastern India. And this picture shows the terrible natural disaster that occurred there in 2013, the flooding that caused immense devastation and loss of life, and which was caused to a very large extent by human environmental engineering, human environmental interference, and by climate change as well. A really, really powerful set of storms. And it's known now that deforestation, cutting down trees too far, over-exploiting the land, cutting those trees down, is one of the principal causes of the landslides that followed. And there's a reference you can look at in the printed version of this talk if you want to read more about the terrible, terrible floods there and the landslides that occurred because the slopes were unstable and all the mud got washed down. The trees have been stripped off from the land. So that's just one of very many reasons. That's a practical reason, but why the idea of bestowing some significance and protection to trees can be very important, can be a matter of life and death even. Protection of the environment, considering the environment special and worth preserving, is built into the earliest religious practice we know of. And next week we'll be looking at deserts to see just how important that idea becomes when you're living somewhere with even more scant resources than mountainous regions. So I'm going to finish with my last slide I'll talk about, just bringing us back to Scripture to close off all this great talk about all these different things. So we'll go to the next slide now. And here in the final slide, I'm sure you all know this famous passage from Luke 12. If you want to read it through, you can hit the pause button. But it's Luke 12, looking about Jesus talking about the natural world. And he talks about the beauty of the natural world as well. But notice that he doesn't actually just mention the beauty in passing, like a parable to illustrate a bigger point. Here, Jesus actually is using the imperative form of a verb. He's commanding us with his language to do something. This is something that Jesus rarely does. He often just says, well, here's a thing, and talks about a parable and so on, and doesn't give very black and white answers to people. But here he says, consider the lilies of the valley. In other words, look at the beautiful plants around us. Think about what the nature of true beauty is. This is Jesus instructing us. Consider the ravens, consider the lilies. So we can take this gospel literally in our studies, and we can go and continue to examine the natural landscapes that surround our Christian places of worship, and further beyond, still beyond those churchyards, into the wider landscape. So I look forward very much to sharing this amazing journey with you over the course of the next 10 weeks. Thank you for today, and finally, if you go on to the next slide, just a little reminder. And here we have, just to say, don't forget our Zoom chat, which is coming up at 2 p.m. on London time this Thursday, 18th of February. And please do also add your comments to this week's forum as well, which is now open. So I'd love to hear your feedback, your thoughts, your connections from what I've been talking about today. I'm very much looking forward to it, and thank you again for coming on this great journey with me.